I will be available for questions if we have time during this webinar. We do have a high number of attendees, so I ask that you please submit those questions via the chat function on your webinar application. Again, please use the chat function. You'll notice there is a Q&A as well, but it's easiest to use the chat, so then there's just one thing I need to look at throughout the course of the webinar. Also, you'll see on the bottom of every page an email address. That's BACP outreach at cityofchicago.org. If for whatever reason I don't answer your question, either I don't get to it, or perhaps I need to consult with some other folks in the city in order to answer that question, please submit your questions to that email, and me or someone from my team will follow up shortly with some answers. Or if there's a question that you don't think of, or if it's very specific and you don't ask it during the webinar, or anything related to reopening, please send it to our outreach email there, and we'll make sure to follow up as soon as possible. So again, BACP outreach at cityofchicago.org. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them via the chat. So again, today is all about phase 4. So what will today's agenda look like? So first, I'm going to discuss, is all about phase 4 called Gradually Resume in the city of Chicago. So first, I'm going to provide an overview of phase 4, what it means citywide, and how we got here. I'm going to talk about the specific reopening guidelines for personal services. I'm going to give you an overview of some reopening resources, and I'm going to talk about enforcement and operational requirements that you need to follow as you're reopening your personal services. Before we get into the details of this webinar, I want to make sure that everybody is visiting chicago.gov/reopening. I have it on this slide and I just typed it into the chat. This is where you'll find an overview of all of the guidelines for all the different industries under phase 4, which again is starting this Friday, June 26th. So if you haven't visited that site, I recommend that you do so as soon as possible, because many of your questions will be answered there. So again, before getting into the specific guidelines for personal services, I want to talk briefly about phase 4 and about what this means for the city as a whole, what it means about your personal life, your friends, your family, your other businesses that you either have or may encounter. So phase 4 means gradually resume. So again, this entire framework, all of the decisions made over the past few months related to reopening are all based on the health metrics. We would not be here, we would not be at phase 4 if the health data didn't tell us that we're ready for this. This is an absolutely critical thing to say, especially as we see reopening too quickly in other states and cities around the country, how that can lead to a spike in the virus. So we're ready for phase 4 on Friday because our health metrics tell us so. And it's critical that as we move to phase 4, we keep essential safeguards and essential framework in place to make sure that we are not we're not reversing all the positive trends that we've made over the last few weeks. So it's again important, I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's all about kind of turning a dimmer switch, not flipping on a light switch. If we reopen too quickly and unsafely, we will see the spike in the virus that we're seeing in other states, and we may have to move back to phase 3 or even phase 2, God forbid. So again, it's critical that we follow these guidelines and stay very safe while we are entering phase 4 again this Friday. So what does phase 4 look like? The goal is to further reopen Chicago while ensuring the safety of residents. So you kind of see across the board some themes on all the different guidelines related to phase 4. So first of all, you'll see that really most businesses are able to reopen, provided that they can keep social distancing and that they can maintain that 25% capacity number for the maximum gathering of 50 individuals in indoor settings. So you'll find that's a theme across industries, 25% capacity with a maximum of 50 individuals at any indoor settings. It's also the case for your social gatherings. Social gatherings should be limited to no more than 50 people. But it's critical. We're not out of the woods. We're still having hundreds of cases a day. We're still having people die of this virus every single day. So social distancing should still be in place critically. Face covering should be worn. It's absolutely essential. We're not out of the woods just because we're ready for the next phase. So if you learn and take nothing else away from this webinar, you should take the fact that continuing to distance and allowing vulnerable residents to shelter. And if you have symptoms, if you are sick, you should be staying home and you should be tested. Months ago, we said only be tested if you're vulnerable. It's not the case anymore. Everybody should be tested if they have symptoms or think they had COVID-19. You'll see in some of these guidelines and some of the personal services and in a lot of the other ones that we are stricter on certain requirements than the state guidelines. If you're located in the city of Chicago, you should be following the city of Chicago guidelines, and those guidelines are stricter in some capacities than the state guidelines. And the reason for that is pretty clear. We're a dense city. We've had more cases here and a higher rate of cases than a lot of other places around the state. So necessarily, we have to follow stricter guidelines than the state. So we're ready to move to phase 4 on Friday with the rest of the state. However, we do not have the exact same guidelines as the rest of the state. So what I'm going over today is for City of Chicago businesses. If you're not located within the City of Chicago, you should be following the state guidelines. So what are you seeing in phase 4 across the board? So childcare centers, family childcare. Summer programs can begin in phase 4. Parks and libraries and other city services can reopen. The lakefront, as I'm sure you saw, reopened yesterday. Office-based jobs, professional services, real estate services opening at 25% capacity. Hotels and lodgings, outdoor attractions, 25% capacity again for anything indoors. Outdoor attractions, that the number is 50 for indoor, the number is 100 for outdoor attractions, no more than 100 per gathering. Retail stores, non-essential reopened under phase 3, can continue to operate under phase 4. Personal services, our focus for today, we're able to open under phase 3. We'll now have new guidelines in place for phase 4. And I see a couple questions come in. I promise I will get to those as part of the guidelines. Health and fitness clubs, they were able to reopen just for one-on-one training or outdoor classes under phase 3. Under phase 4, they can expand their operations to have indoor classes and indoor service, indoor activity under 25% capacity. Restaurants and bars, indoor dining, I'm sure you saw, can reopen this Friday. Again, 25% capacity. That's something across the board at all these different industries. Places of worship opened under guidelines in the middle of phase 3. Museums and zoos will be reopening under phase 4. Performance venues and movie theaters can reopen under phase 4. Under, you guessed it, 25% capacity with no more than 50 people at any indoor setting. Again, 25% capacity, no more than 50 people. That's the requirement truly across the board. So what do I mean when I say personal services? These are beauticians, beauty salons, nail salons, tanning salons, hairstylists, barbershops, hair replacement services, anything like that. Wellness like day spas, massage establishments, saunas, and other services, ear piercing services, tattoo parlors. Really, while this may be obvious, like if you're a hair salon, it's obvious your personal services. Makeup falls under this as well. Really, anything where you have one-on-one service provided to an individual where you are in close quarters with that individual. Anything like that should be following the personal services. We are even recommending, and I know this is probably not where most of the folks are in the webinar, but if someone provides like one-on-one classes or training, for example, where they have to be in close quarters, we are recommending that they follow the personal service requirements for that. So this is really for anything that has this one-on-one aspect to it. Again, in close quarters. So, what will you find again at chicago.gov/reopening? Recommend that everybody visits there if they haven't yet. You'll find the industry guidelines, and again, you'll find industry guidelines for personal services. But maybe you're curious what the CTA looks like, or you want to go visit a restaurant and want to know what restaurant guidelines are in place. You can find all of those at that website. You can also find a self-certification. So now we plugged this before for phase 3. Now you can visit the website for a phase 4 self-certification to show that you are that you know the phase 4 guidelines and you're ready and able to follow them. And then you can get a little badge that you can print to put up at your establishment to show your employees and to show your workers, your employees and to show your customers that you know the phase 4 guidelines. There's also additional resources there, including posters that you can and should download and print to put around your establishment. The phase 4 guidelines have been published as of yesterday afternoon. So those should be on the chicago.gov/reopening site. If you aren't able to find them, send me an email at BACPoutreach@cityofchicago.org, and I'll make sure to point you in the right direction. But these guidelines I am reviewing today are already posted at chicago.gov/reopen. And also, again, if you have any questions, if even at the end of this webinar you have questions, or someone else has a question, and you want to know if what industry you fall in, something like that, whether you can reopen, what guidelines you should be following, you can submit those to 311. You can also, again, email us, BACPoutreach@cityofchicago.org. So what will you find? What will you find in these guidelines? So all the guidelines for all different industries are split up in the following way. First of all, healthy interactions. Social distancing, again, we're ready to reopen. We're ready to go to that next stage. 6 feet of social distancing is still that magic number. You need to maintain 6 feet of social distancing. Gathering size, your magic number for indoor gathering size is 50. And that's the case, again, for all different industries. Probably not super relevant for personal services. I don't think many hair salons, for example, have higher than 50, more than 50 folks inside. But if you do, you must be limited to 50, and also 25% capacity. Protective gear, face coverings are still critical. And we'll talk in detail about what that means for personal services. And then obviously hygiene requirements. Safe spaces and conditions, maintaining entry access, cleaning standards, visual guidance, workplace conditions, things like that. And finally, operational resilience and monitoring. What can you do to make sure that we don't have an outbreak into the future and that we are ready and prepared if and when that happens? Because again, the last thing we want to do is to revert back to phase 3 or to even, God forbid, phase 2. So now I'm going to answer a couple of the questions that are coming in. I wanted to talk in detail about the guidelines for phase 4. I'm going to go into detail in the next few slides about what this means. I'm also going to highlight specifically the items that are different in phase 4 than phase 3. So first, here's a visual, here's an overview. You should set up workstations to allow for physical distancing where necessary. So your chairs should be 6 feet apart. Sanitizing products should be available for both employee and client use. All individuals are required to wear face coverings at all times, and this is a difference in phase 4, and this is going to answer a couple questions, except when they are removed for services that require them to be removed, such as facials or beard shaves. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. Employees should be disinfecting facilities frequently. Customers should be encouraged to make reservations for services. So now walk-ins can be allowed, but we're still encouraged to use appointments. And visual signage should be posted throughout the establishment. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. So here's the details now of those guidelines. Again, highlighted in red to show you the key changes from phase 3. First of all, regarding social distancing, you should be ensuring 6 feet between individuals and close choke points. You ensuring that all areas allow for 6 feet of social distance. Now you can place an impermeable barrier between workstations if you cannot provide 6 feet of distance. Before we said you should be decommissioning those. Now you can place impermeable barriers between workstations if you cannot provide for 6 feet of social distancing. We're also encouraging that at checkout counters and other places where social distancing is not practiced. You should be limiting your capacity to 25%. This excludes staff. And you should be limiting all gatherings to no more than 50 individuals. So 25% or 50, whichever is fewer. Now, I know we get some questions about how to calculate 25% capacity. And to make it clear, this is not new. Personal services have been under that 25% capacity rule under phase 3 as well. But to talk a little bit about what we mean by 25% capacity. First of all, this capacity limit is based on the on the square footage of your location. Now, it is not based on the total number of clients you could have at any one point. It's based on how many clients, how many customers you could fit within the entire space. And we're asking folks to calculate and to use their judgment on how to calculate 25% capacity. Essentially, you should take your business. All businesses are set up a little bit differently. And within each space, you should be making sure that you are at 25% of your maximum capacity. So under typical circumstances, if you would be able to fit 16 people in a space, 16 customers in a space, you should now be limiting that to 25% of that. And if you have a giant location, for example, you should have no more than 50 individuals maximum within any one area. Again, face coverings must be worn over the nose and the mouth. They could only be removed for certain services that require them to be removed. However, this should only be done with employees fully understanding the risk of exposure. This is something that we're not taking lightly. We know that facials, beard shaves, things like that do provide a significant added risk to employees, particularly. So the employee themselves must be wearing PPE while doing these procedures and these services. And we strongly recommend, if possible, to provide these services in a separate room. And again, employees should be understanding the risk of exposure, because the fact is, when face coverings are removed in a close environment like this, there is a significant added risk of exposure. We're recommending that folks limit these procedures to under 10 minutes if possible, because the science shows that the way that this is most easily transmitted is when folks are within 6 feet for 10 minutes or more. So while these activities, these services are allowed under phase 4, again, we strongly, we know that these services can provide a significant added risk of exposure. So please do proceed with extreme caution and make sure that employees understand the risk of exposure to the virus. Again, everything I'm talking about today, all these things in red, they do come into effect this Friday. So I don't want anyone to say, hey, the city told me I can start doing beard shaves today. No, these start on Friday. We're not in phase 4 yet. We're starting phase 4 on Friday. You should be providing sanitizing products for customer use and ensure that employees are washing hands before and after every service. Every product that's handled should be sanitizing, and you should be getting rid of samples or testers, anything like that. You should also be providing this training and walking through all these new guidelines with your employees, and ideally providing some sort of training to refresh them on proper hygiene. This is something that should be re-emphasized consistently with all of your employees. You should be implementing some sort of screening measure for employees and customers. What does this mean? At minimum, the minimum requirement is that you make sure that employees self-screen so that they don't have, to show that they don't have symptoms of COVID-19 before going to work. And they obviously should not be going to work if they have symptoms or if they feel ill in any way. That's the minimum. And minimum, employees should self-screen. Now, we encourage folks to do more. And we encourage folks to do more and to check, to do temperature checks, things like that. but at minimum, you should be having them self-screen. You should post a pledge upon an entrance or conduct screening verifying customer or external supplier is not currently exhibiting COVID-19. Again, you can do more. You can do a bigger screening, but at minimum, you should be posting a pledge upon your entrance, basically saying, by entering this establishment, I pledge that I do not have COVID-19 symptoms. Question here, thank you. What do you do if an employee has allergies? So a couple things. At that chicago.gov/reopening site, and I'll put it up again so you don't forget, you can find language of what this self-screening should look like. So there are specific questions that employees should be asking in order to make sure that what they have is COVID-19 symptoms. So obviously, if an employee has allergies, we're not saying they have to stay home sick. It's just if they have a fever, a new cough, something like that. And you can also visit chicago.gov/coronavirus for all the latest information on the COVID-19 outbreak, including what are symptoms and what aren't symptoms. So, but if an employee thinks, isn't sure if what they have is allergies or symptoms of COVID-19, well, then they should be getting tested. If you have any concern that you might have symptoms, you should be getting tested. Daily cleaning standards should be in place. You should be disinfecting high-touch areas after each customer use. Sanitizing other high-touch areas frequently throughout the day, such as doors or handles. All equipment should be sanitized after each client, and you should be minimizing the sharing of tools and, if practical for certain services, using disposable equipment. And here's something new for phase 4. You can allow self-serve food or drink stations if the employee is serving the food and wearing proper PPE. So again, self-serve food or drink stations can reopen, but the employee should be serving the food or drink and wearing PPE, like, coffee machines, things like that. You should be still providing visual guidance on hygiene standards and entry requirements. There's signage that the health department has put together about the 6 feet social distancing, wearing signage, wearing face coverings, things like that. You should be, if possible, increasing airflow indoors according to CDC guidelines. Question, what about clients drinking while they are doing services? So anytime services are done, face coverings should be worn unless they need to be removed for that service themselves. Again, in phase 3, you were unable to remove face coverings for any reasons. Now they can be removed only for services that require them to be removed. So obviously, to eat or drink, you need to remove your face covering. So folks should not be eating or drinking while they have a service being provided. So you can provide coffee while folks are waiting for their service, for example, but since the face covering should be kept on, except for services that explicitly allow them to be removed, they should not be eating or drinking while they are getting the service provided. Great. Moving on to the next guidelines. Again, I see a couple more questions come in. I will get to those. You should be limiting in-person work where possible. Obviously, folks, your employees will have to be coming to work in order to do a haircut. But as much as possible, you should be minimizing in-person work. So online trainings, virtual staff meetings. Just because you're able to come back to work doesn't mean you need to do everything in person all the time. You should be limiting interaction between individuals, encouraging contactless payment or self-serve checkout where available. You should still only be having one client per employee without schedule overlap. Something new in phase 4. Walk-ins are allowed, and they can wait for an appointment in the establishment if they are social distancing. Again, prior to phase 4, we were saying just appointments and no walk-ins. Now, appointments are still strongly encouraged, but walk-ins are allowed, and they can wait for an appointment if they are social distancing. You should be limiting travel for business. What does this mean? If you have multiple establishments, they should be limiting the travel between them so staff are not in multiple different locations. And that's obviously to make sure that the less folks we interact with, the safer everyone is. And finally, and very importantly, we should be following health department and CDC guidance for testing and tracing protocols. You should be prepared for somebody contracting COVID-19. Hope it doesn't happen, but you should not be surprised when it does, and you should have a plan in place. So follow the CDC guidelines for what that means, including cleaning and disinfecting workplace following that occurrence. And if any other employee has close contact with a coworker that has COVID-19, they should self-quarantine. Importantly, if you become aware of 2 or more cases possibly associated with your establishment over a 14-day period, you are required to report those cases to the health department. Also, for each customer, this was a requirement for phase 3, and it is still in place. You should keep a log of your name and contact information for each of the customers for at least 60 days following the service. This is obviously something to help us with contact tracing if needed, because we know, we've seen it in other places, that personal services and the reopening of them too quickly and without the proper safeguards can lead to a spike in the virus. So please follow these guidelines. Now, I've got a little bit more I want to cover, but I do want to open it up for a couple questions. With the 10-minute recommendation, if facials are 50 minutes, should we not be providing these services yet? Let me be a little clear. That 10-minute recommendation is a recommendation and just that. So while you can have services lasting longer than 10 minutes, we want folks to know that, when a one-on-one service without a mask, without a face covering is, for longer than 10 minutes, can have an increased risk for the virus spreading. It is allowed over 10 minutes. That 10 minutes is a recommendation, but we want to just make sure folks understand the inherent risk to something like this. I got a question about a flyer called Wear It Right Chicago about wearing masks appropriately. So no, that's not a flyer I'm aware of. I don't think that is part of the health department's printable resources. But if you send us an email, I can see what I can find and see if the health department has any specific recommendations. The important thing when it comes to face coverings, they can be masks, they can be shirts, they can be scarves. The important thing is that it is fully covering your nose and your mouth. That is the important thing. It doesn't matter really what else it looks like as long as it is fully covering your nose and your mouth. So again, facial service using steam involved with that, anything involved with facial services can be restarting under phase 4 but again, the important thing, I want everyone to understand the risk. And ultimately, if you as a provider, it's up to you to evaluate the risk there. I had a question about saunas and steam rooms, if they're allowed to reopen. They are allowed to reopen under the physical distancing requirements. If anyone has any specific questions on how to calculate the 25%, you can please send us an email, and I'll connect you with the building department here, because there are folks that can help kind of guide people through that calculation. But again, this is something that has been in place since phase 3. The idea is for you, the business owner, to make the determination of what constitutes a 25% capacity. If you want to send us an email about a specific square footage calculation, we're happy to help with that via email. Great question. Is there an amount of employees that are allowed in? Again, that capacity requirement is not for employees. That is just for customers. So there's not a specific requirement of the number of employees that are allowed in, but you should be making sure that social distancing is possible. If all your employees returning to work makes it so you cannot have social distancing in place, then they should not be all returning to work. But there is not a specific guidance on that. Great. And I think to the question about saunas and steam rooms, there may be some portion of a of a personal service establishment that may kind of look a little bit more like a health or fitness center. And the saunas and steam rooms question is covered in the health and fitness center guidelines. So I recommend that you check out those guidelines on the reopening website. And again, that's kind of like a general recommendation. A lot of businesses may kind of cover multiple different industries, and we recommend our guidance is if you should be following the specific industry guidelines for any of your operations that fit within those guidelines. Like for example, if you have retail service as well, you should be following the retail guidelines for that service. So I wanted to put this up just to make it very clear what why we're at where we're at phase 4, that everything we're doing is based on the health metrics and the numbers that we're seeing regarding the cases in Chicago. No decisions that we're not making any decisions based on arbitrary dates and arbitrary choices. Everything we're doing is based on the science and based on the health metrics. So the reason why we're ready for phase 4, and you can see it within you can see it highlighted here, is that we have made it under 200 cases a day. That was our main number. We're looking at many numbers. That was one main number we were looking at to get to phase 4. So phase 4 means that we have somewhere between 100 and 199 cases a day. I believe the most recent 7-day rolling average is 167 new cases a day. Under that guidelines, because we made it under 200, and we're very happy that we've made it under 200, we can now have indoor capacity up to 25%. Gathering size can now be up to 50 people indoors and 100 people in outdoors. Now, again, we're using the health metrics, so we will be ready to move to higher capacity of 50% once we get under 100 cases a day. This is not arbitrary. And we know a lot of other states, it seems, they've kind of just opened up too soon. We're using the health numbers to tell us when we're ready to reopen. So I want to make it clear that 25% and 50 people is based on the numbers. And if the numbers keep improving, we'll be ready to move to a higher capacity. So the question that just came in, if we get under 100, we might be able to have more capacity for salons. Correct. We are hopeful. So just to talk a little bit about the phases, phase 4 is gradually resumed, and that's what we're going to be answering on Friday. And phase 5 is really back to normal. But that doesn't mean that we hit phase 4 and then we wait for phase 5. We expect that there will be changes throughout phase 4, and we hope that we can make progress throughout phase 4 to move up to 50%, to move to 75%. And that'll be entirely based on the numbers. It won't be until we get very low to less than 20 cases a day in the whole city that we'll be ready truly for full reopening and full back to normal. But if we do get under 100, we're hopeful that we'll be able to move to 50% capacity. Now, there are other metrics we're looking at, and I want to make it clear, I am not the health expert, so I can't speak too much to all the other metrics that we're looking at, but we will hopefully be able to move up to 50%. The health commissioner has said it could happen in as soon as the next few weeks, but it's all about what the numbers say. And if we find that reopening leads to a significant spike in cases, we will unfortunately have to move back to phase 3. Last thing I want to cover, I want to remind folks, of the phase 4 guidelines, the phase 4 self-certification that you can take on our reopening website. So this is really a series of questions that you can answer to show that you understand the new guidelines and that you're ready to move to phase 4, and to show your employees and your customers that you know the guidelines and that you're committed to following them. So you can again find that at our reopening website. I'm going to open it up for a couple more questions if anyone has any. And I just do want to remind folks, again, email us at bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org if I didn't answer your question, if you have any other questions or anything else related to reopening. I want to emphasize and put this slide back up just for a second. I want to really reiterate and emphasize the importance of reopening safely under these guidelines. These are not things that we want businesses to push the limits on. We understand that it's obviously been an incredibly challenging time over the last few weeks and months. We understand that you're all very excited to get back to this next phase. We also want to preach caution. And while we are moving to that next phase, and while our metrics have been really good, we also know that we're not out of the woods yet. And it's critical that we continue to take these necessary safety precautions in order to keep us, our residents, our customers, our employees safe and healthy. So I want to thank you all for your time. Again, please reach out to our email here on the bottom if you have any questions, and stay safe. Thank you.